It's the Yukon podcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And Jeff, we are here today to discuss The Second Self, which is a book from 1984 by the American academic Sherry Turkle. We are here to discuss this book because it is a foundational text in the study of human-computer interactions. We want to take the book on its merits, consider it in retrospect from where we are today. And in particular, we want to see if we can draw parallels between the moment that Sherry Turkle was writing about, which was the moment that computers went into American homes en masse, and Americans and people around the world were forced to kind of deal with them as everyday objects. And the moment we're living through now, which is generative AI such as ChatGPT, has ended our phones, our computers, and all the rest of it en masse, and individuals in society are having to sort of interact with these new technologies.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is the time capsule element of it. It really returned me as I was reading it to a lot of the kind of elements of my youth that I had forgotten about or just hadn't really thought about in a long time. I had a speak and spell. We did have Texas Instruments computer of some sort. I can't remember the name of it, that was in the house. And my brother did do some programming stuff. And I had forgotten about how you had to type in the commands in order to get the computer to do anything. And it returns me to, she has a long chapter about early video games, early arcade games. So Space Invaders, for example, or Asteroids, right? Which was spent tons of time playing both in arcade form and in that early Atari home video console form. So it was really interesting and neat to kind of transport myself back to those parts of my childhood and to realize that in a lot of ways, what we have now is just a kind of a natural continuation of the technological processes, the rising role as a computer in the home that had begun in the late 1970s. And
I remember being bought a computer by my mum and dad, and the goal was to get a computer that was compatible with the computers that would exist that they had at school, in the school kind of computer lab. I was told very definitely that this was not a games machine, that it had to be used for some sort of practical purpose. And I remember that you would buy computer magazines, and what you'd find in these computer magazines were often these kind of blocks of code, and the code was to make like a sprite appear on screen and move left and move right, and you had to type in the program to make the computer do anything. And this was recreation. This was childhood when we were kids. But I tell you what, we were damn lucky to have electricity. That's what I was told.
I never really did any programming myself. It was not something that I was attracted to. My older brother was far more attracted to the sort of the mechanics of how the thing worked. And I would think that in a lot of ways, he would have been a really interesting case study, as we'll see, a great deal. In fact, most of how Turkle proceeds in this book is through a kind of case study observational method. He would have been a really interesting case study, I think, for her.
Well, both of you would, because one of her points is that your personality is reflected and in some degree shaped by the way that you interact with the computer. And so to have two brothers, having totally different relationships with computers would have been kind of prime fodder for Sherry Turkle's sort of ethnographic case study-based method. Now, Jeff, there is a danger that people listening to this or viewing the video might perceive this as being two middle-aged guys talk about a 40-year-old book.
Yeah.
What can you do to put people at ease?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that they are correct.
Good point.
It is two middle-aged guys talking about a 40-year-old
Good
book.
sales pitch.
The second thing I would say, though, is that a great deal of what Turkle does in her analysis, which is, as you've suggested, really focused upon the relationships that develop between humans, in her case, humans and computers, but the broader point is between humans and machines, between humans and sophisticated machines, that her analysis, I think, has a lot of leverage that we can still get out of it for our contemporary interactions with things like our smartphones and, for our purposes, the sort of metastasization of AI across all forms of society, including in all of our hobbies, right? I mean, think about we both play guitar a lot. We both, it turns out, rely upon AI-based technological innovations to improve our experiences. Right. And the degree to which that technology has so quickly and so seemingly easily integrated itself in the day-to-day flow of our lives, I think is a relationship. It's a set of interests that Sherry Turkle she's interested in this 40 years ago. And I think she's onto it to something or to a set of things 40 years ago that remain highly relevant for helping us to understand the impacts of these things today.
Yeah, I think so. And although the second self subtitle, Computers in the Human Spirit, this was Sherry Turkle's, I think, first book.
No.
It wasn't her first book?
No, she has a book from the 1970s, an earlier book on Lacan and psychoanalysis.
Oh, okay. But it's her first foray into this kind of, I mean, that's a crucial point that Sherry Turkle was trained in psychoanalysis and in the second self brings psychoanalysis to bear on these technological issues. But the second self certainly inaugurated the kind of arc of work for which she is most known, which is as one of the American Academy's leading chroniclers of human technology interaction, led her to numerous well-known books. I think perhaps most famously Alone Together, which was a book of kind of 2011, I think, that discussed how the increasing kind of technologized or mediated nature of our interactions with things like companionable robots, but also things like just the interactions over social media rather than person-to-person interactions were perhaps reshaping what we thought of as companionship and culture. Numerous other books, I know we just discussed before we went on the air, she just wrote an acclaimed memoir, which is well worth reading, and the Empathy Diaries. I think we have a structure with which we want to, or through which we want to attack this, Jeff. We have a number of points that we want to hit, and I think we're going to pull some key quotes from the second self and kind of react to those quotes as we go along. First, we want to talk about what is the second self. Then I think we want to talk about the time capsule elements of this book, the way in which it's both of 1984 when it's written, but it in some sense stands a test of time or sheds a new light on today, I suppose would be the way to talk about that. Third, we want to talk about what is one of the conceptual cores of her book. The question she asks, what type of thing is the computer? And the way in which she sees that is totally tied up with the question, what type of thing is a human, or what type of things are we? Fourth, we wanted to talk about the transparent and the opaque in computational technologies. She makes a big deal, and we just alluded to it, to the very different sort of user interface that computers had when they first emerged in the home versus the opacity of their workings and mechanics as they present themselves in the latest iteration of generative large language models. And then finally, we wanted to talk about weird artifacts of the 1980s that appear in the second self, things that just kind of stand out in a honk fashion as being of that time, predictions that didn't pan out, or 80s ways of thinking that we can say probably don't have relevance today.
Yeah.
Should we get into it?
Let's go.
Okay, so question one, what is the second self?
Yeah, so the second self is I was going to say an illusion. It's a description. It's not an illusion. It's a description of the way in which human beings have invested critical parts of themselves, of their subjectivity, of their sense of selves into, in Turkle's case, into computers, more broadly perhaps into machines, or into maybe better said, into the products of humanity. And the way that then these relationships that develop create a scenario in which people come to imagine the thing, the output, the product, the computer, as so integral to their own sense of self that it becomes itself a second self.
Yeah, I think that's true. I wanted to read you a quote that I thought kind of captured what Turkle was up to here. It's actually ironically from the end of the book. She is a really good writer, and maybe this is the time to say this. She's a really good writer. She writes in a specific way, which is there's a lot of showing, not telling, right? There's a lot of uncovering broader theoretical or overarching points through this kind of case study methodology that I think you cued me into as being not just what we'd consider ethnography, but being sort of fairly explicitly Freudian in nature. And that means often that the core to her arguments is found quite deep in this book. And the passage I found most revealing as to what she was up to is on page 279 of her book. Ours has been called a culture of narcissism. The label is apt but can be misleading. It reads colloquially as selfishness and self-absorption, but these images do not capture the anxiety behind our search for mirrors. We are insecure in our understanding of ourselves, and this insecurity breeds a new preoccupation with the question of who we are. We search for ways to see ourselves. The computer is a new mirror, the first psychological machine, Beyond its nature as an analytical engine lies its second nature as an evocative object. So is it this notion of mirrors and ways of seeing ourselves that is the second self?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And the extent to which it is, as she calls it, an evocative object. These are objects, products that evoke in us both a sense of familiarity, a sense of what she also refers to quite frequently in this book of the Freudian, the uncanny, right? The sense that something is familiar, but now seen as unusual or seen in ways almost with new eyes. And that there's something about the evocative object that articulates the uncanny.
Yeah.
And, the way I like to think about this is, you have young children. I don't any longer have young children.
But you did.
But one of the things
that's how it works.
One of the things that happens when you're parenting that I noticed is that you end up kind of seeing all of these things that you have taken for granted, natural processes, snowfall, the way that ice forms, for example, the way the wind blows or how grass grows, things that you have so taken for granted because they are not any longer interesting to you. When you experience a child experiencing those things for the first time, there is that sense of the uncanny. And this is what Turkle is arguing is, I think her argument is that this is kind of the core appeal of the evocative object, that it evokes in the person this sense of the uncanny, this sense of familiarity, but also opening up and seeing things with new eyes that you thought you already knew or that you just took for granted. And here it's a part of the self that then gets lodged through this process of uncanny transference, I suppose, into the object itself, making the object the second self.
Yeah, and this gives a reasoning behind the structure of her book, which is to go through the stages of, I was going to say sort of development into an adult, but I suppose in psychoanalytic terms, the sort of personality development, right? The question is posed, how do humans relate to computers through a kind of life stages model of the development of human psychology? So she has this model of, very young children who interact with the computer and they see it as a sort of metaphysical object. And the questions they're asking is this alive, right? How do I, so it's what you were saying, that we know computers are not alive, and with artificial intelligence, we've had that thrown into question, which is why it's such a fascinating subject. But we thought we took for granted we know what kind of object a computer is. But for someone first encountering them without stable categories of things, it's a weird question because it is doing things that other dead things or inanimate objects don't do. It's responding to you, it's interacting with you, it seems to have a mind and some degree of agency. And so it puts itself in this kind of liminal or boundary crossing space that makes children, as she says, the youngest children, it makes them into sort of philosophers of life in their first interactions with computers.
Right. What makes something alive?
Right, exactly. Then she takes us through, other life stages. Children, when they get a little older, they stop asking, is it alive? They start asking, how can I master this thing? And then when they become adolescents, they start using the computer as a sort of identity object, a way to express who they are and a sense for the thing to tell them who they are. Yeah. And then as adults, you're interested in kind of different things. The thing almost as a tool, but also in some senses, and we're going to come to this, I think, in some depth, as a model for how other types of systems could be made to work.
Yeah, you're right. It's a development process that she lays out, which is another way of saying, and this is also kind of a core element of the psychoanalysis of which the schools of psychoanalysis of which she was trained in and of which she is a part. It's also a focus upon the maturation process. And how it is that human beings come to understand themselves, in essence, as both in and out of the world at the same time. How is it that infants, for example, come to understand that they are not simply appendages of their mother? How is it that they come to understand that they have some autonomous self? What are the feelings that are associated with that realization of kind of a semi-autonomy? And then what does all of that mean, right, over the course of one's life? How do you manage the relationships that you might have with other people? How do you come to find empathy in others? How do you come to use those senses of identification or lack of identification as fodder for your own sense of self? Right. So that all of this is a way to say that although this is a book on its surface that appears to be about computers and about early computing, it's really a book about human beings. And it's really a book about how human beings interact with or don't interact with these kinds of objects that they end up in, or that we end up investing so much of our sense of self in.
Yeah, and it's about human beings. And I think here we'll move to point two, the kind of time capsule element of the book. I'll situate this at a moment in time. It's about human beings at a particular point in their history, right? Which is for the first time, they're being confronted in domestic, workplace and educational settings with this new type of object, the computer. And it's not that before, I don't know, the late 70s or early 80s, it's not that computers were unknown, but computers for most people would be not a everyday part of their life, right? What is a computer? It's the thing that the astronauts in the Apollo module used, and it was this massive technical thing operated by highly skilled engineers that was just not a part of everyday life. So Turkle says the goal of the book, this is her, actually writing in retrospect about what she was thinking, why she wrote this book at the time. The goal of the book was to understand how ideas move out from a sophisticated technical circle into the culture as a whole, and once there, how they shape the way people think about themselves. The second self documents a moment in history when people from all walks of life, not just computer scientists and artificial intelligence researchers, were first confronted with machines whose behavior and mode of operation invited psychological interpretation, and that at the same time incited them to think differently about human thought, memory, and understanding. And of course, people had done that, right? Yeah. But it was an elitist preoccupation. Like that could be the tagline or a blurb for like 2001: A Space Odyssey. But that was about a supercomputer operated by super astronauts. And even in its presentation in 1968 was an art house meditative film designed for intellectuals to reflect upon, well, what would we think about, it's doing the same thing as this book. Yeah. What would we think about human beings when we're confronted with a non-human object, HAL 9000, that is thinking and behaving and acting as a human? Yeah. And what it would mean in Kubrick's vision was this epochal transformation of our species and our place in the cosmos. It was literally crossing a boundary, from one type of species to another, to the point that this isn't supposed to be about 2001. You know the plot, right? That it triggered in the aliens who'd been overseeing this a new understanding of human beings' capacity. Turkle is now saying, that the monolith has entered everyone's house.
Right. Yeah, and so it is absolutely, the book and the analysis in that way is absolutely of its time. And you're right that prior to the late 1970s and early 1980s, you didn't have a PC, or people forget PC stands for personal computer, right? Which at the time was a very self-conscious designation for this thing. What you had were these enormous banks of machines that would fill up, a university, 3 or 4 rooms in a large university hall, for example, or, in some kind of physics laboratory or at NASA or something like that. And so it's the advent of a very particular kind of technology and its insertion into a very prosaic realm of life, the everyday.
Yeah.
And what happens when you do that?
Yeah, there's a great scene in a later season in Mad Men when they're into the I think the mid 1970s, and the advertising company gets its computer and it has its own room, and it's this giant foreboding thing, and the only people who can go in are kind of engineers with clipboards, and of course the creatives won't have anything to do with this sort of abomination, and that was computers prior to this moment. Okay, so that situates it, I think, in time capsule terms. Let's move to the third of our kind of categories here. What type of thing is the computer, and what type of thing is the person?
Yeah.
What do you think Turkle's kind of driving at here?
Well, I think that what she's getting at when she talks about what kind of thing is the computer, she's designating as an evocative object, right? Something that prompts human beings to invest bits and pieces of their sense of self, their sense of identity in it, and then has a kind of recursive or interactive relationship where it offers human beings the capacity to express themselves in ways that Turkle argues are fundamentally new, because those expressions of self can then be returned by the machine.
Yeah.
So it's not like painting a canvas necessarily, right? In which the artist expresses themselves, but then that mode of expression is sort of concretized on the painting, I suppose, or on the canvas. It's as though you did all that, but then the canvas then has the capacity to say something back to you or interact back with you. And so on one hand, it's an evocative object in that way. On the other hand, she also refers this to the computer as a transitional object. And here you need to get a little bit deep in this sort of Melanie Klein vision of psychoanalysis or variant of psychoanalysis to understand what she's getting at here. But in layman's terms, what that tradition means by the transitional object is the same thing that Turkle means to characterize the computer as, which is this notion that when young children, when infants begin to separate from their mothers in particular and begin to develop some consciousness, or at least the theory is develop some consciousness of their autonomous existence in the world, that they are not simply an appendage of their mother. It's only at that point, that is in psychoanalytic terms considered to be such a traumatic moment in the emotional life of the infant that it's too much to bear, right? And so it prompts rage, and it prompts sorrow, and it prompts desire for reconnecting with the mother. And so the theory is that one of the ways you can help young children manage this trauma and this anxiety is you can give them a transitional object, a blanket, a stuffed animal, some kind of toy. And what ends up happening frequently is that the infant then creates this extremely intense bond for some time with the object. And the notion is that this is a transitional object that helps in the process of moving towards the full realization and the full ability of the infant and later the toddler to understand themselves as autonomous beings, as having a place in the world that is not simply connected to the whims and the desires and the needs of the mother.
Yeah. So the
computer ends up being, she argues, is that same thing, right? That it works as a transitional object. I think she wants to say that helps human beings of all ages sort of propel themselves into a different kind of uncertain reality, in the same way that the transitional object helps the infant to propel themselves into an uncertain kind of new reality.
Yeah, so the quote I pulled from the book on transitional object, I think is just saying what you said in other terms. Psychoanalytic theorists call these objects transitional because they're thought to mediate between the child's closely bonded relationship with the mother and his or her capacity to develop relationships with other people who will be experienced as separate autonomous beings. I suppose it does raise the question of what does it do to childhood developments? And she also seems concerned with this. If the transitional object is not a blanket, but it's an apparently reasoning blanket that as you said, kind of the blanket that kind of talks back to you, because it's not then, or is it just the child's projection of meaning onto the blanket?
Well, what's interesting, I think, about this version of Turkle's argument is that I actually read her as far more optimistic about the formative capacities of the transitional object here. And you see this in her case studies of younger children, that for most of these case studies, she's depicting the relationship as basically a positive thing, right? She's depicting this as a relationship in which children of varying different personalities, varying different learning styles, varying modes of being in the world are capable of interacting with the computers in ways that seem to enrich their lives, that seem to help them, right? And at least in this book, right, the notion of, we don't get a lot, I don't think, from her, a lot of concern about the potential negative or alienating or oscillating elements of this kind of relationship with the transitional object. Now, in later work, and Alone Together in particular, that is absolutely at the forefront, right? And Alone Together I think, is actually a very pessimistic book about what happens to human beings when we engage in these relationships that she describes there as if relationships. They're not human because they lack the full depth and expanse of meaningful human relationships, but they mimic human relationships enough, right? People get enough of a response out of the sociable robot, enough of a response out of your phone, enough of a response out of ChatGPT that it is close enough to being human that for a lot of people, she's concerned, it replaces meaningful human relationships because it's predictable and it's safe and you can turn the thing off when it's upsetting you. None of which you can do, of course, in human relationships. And so I think there's a hint of concern in The Second Self, but I read her, and maybe you see this differently, I read her as basically being pretty positive about the possibilities and the transformative possibilities of this particular type of transitional and evocative object. She revisits that point in, I think, meaningful ways that we'll talk about later in the preface, right? When she talks about, well, this is actually what happened.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, because in the same way as my dad told me the computer is an educational tool and not a games machine and something that you're going to program and it's going to interface with the thing at school so you can do your schoolwork on it. Like, that was the hope. And what it would do, it was going to be like getting an engineering degree or something, right? It was going to teach you how to operate how to work in a technical world, but a world in which, you program the computer itself. You would then create for yourself a sort of predictable reality, which was the program in which to operate. And it could be kind of useful in solving technical tasks, but also a creative expression of yourself. And rather crucially, it was all transparent to you. It was done by your own hand, and you could understand how your inputs were being translated into the outputs and responses that you got.
Exactly. It was like learning how to work on a combustion engine in a car. It was like learning how to work any sort of machine that had gears and mechanisms, and how to build a watch, right? I mean, this is very much what that early computing culture was that she's talking about, this kind of capacity to control, right? Or at least to understand, right, what you were doing. And even though it was odd, right, if you knew about transistors and if you knew about how to solder stuff and you knew what happened when you connected various bits and pieces of electronics, nothing that you would have found in a computer was all that unusual. It'd be the same thing as making a radio.
And we are back with our discussion of Sherry Turkle's 1984 book, The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit. We were talking in the last section about what type of object is the computer and what type of object is the person in Turkle's view. I think we wanted to move now to a key point that Turkle makes that I think really stands the test of time, which is to do with the transparency versus opaqueness debate. In the technology of the time, Turkle makes a big deal of the way that people would interact with computers as actually being very direct. And this, in some sense, is why she seems so optimistic about the way that children will develop their interactions with computers, and adults might do so as well. The way that you interacted with a computer when it first appeared in the home is you typed in commands, and they were not commands in natural human language, right? They were they were in machine language. Yeah. And if you wanted to get the computer to do anything, you really had to directly, using the computer's language, tell it what to do. She also says at one point that computers were sort of more physically open as well, that it was possible to see more of what was going on. There was just a more direct relationship between the person and the computer. Everything was transparent. You knew why the computer was giving you the response that it was giving you. It's because you yourself had created that kind of architecture. After this point, she says, in certainly the editions we read, she'd written new introductions and new epilogues kind of looking back on The Second Self several decades later. After that point, computational technologies took on ever-increasing degrees of murkiness or opacity. You stopped being able to know why the computer was doing the thing that it was doing. And what fundamentally changed was what came to be known as the user interface. It wasn't just a prompt anymore where you directly typed in commands like let X be Y and let this move to that and all the rest of it. You ended up with things like clickable icons, and you ended up to take this to its conclusion today, you ended up with something like ChatGPT, where you just text it as if it's your pal on a messaging app, in normal language, right? Like, write me a scholarly essay in the style of Sigmund Freud about this kind of thing. And so that mode of interface, or that ability to understand what's going on and why the computer is giving you the answer that it's given you, it appears as if it's easier, or it is easier.
It is.
Right? It's more convenient to you. You're being stretched less, or being taken less outside your normal kind of ways of interacting. But that easiness is deceiving, because it's hiding the fact that you no longer know what processes the computer is going through to produce the result that you see.
Exactly. And so the act of programming, I should say, becomes a learned and specialized act. In contrast to what Turkle is finding in the early 1980s, where computing culture is a broad and participatory culture, as you say, one that the thing only works, the computer only works, the machine only works to the extent that you are capable of programming it yourself. And the advent of, really it's Apple, right? And the advent of the Mac, and that interface system, and the advent of the mouse as an object that allows you to kind of move around and just click an icon, whether that icon be what we're typically used to now as an image, or what frequently was then a string of commands itself, like a bit of language, like, open, right? Or file open, or print, or whatever. Stuff that you can just click on. And unless you are a specialized computer programmer, you don't see any of that. And you don't know any of it. And maybe you don't want to know any of it. You don't care. But this is really important, I think, for Turkle's sense of the possibilities of computers. And so I think for our sense of the possibilities of AI was the capacity, the requirement to be able to control it. You could only work it if you knew how to program it.
Yeah.
And when that changes, the knowledge to be able to do the programming becomes siloed in a kind of group of elite people who are specialized in it. And so there develops a hierarchy of knowledge about who has capacity to run the thing and how they can run it. And the hierarchy of specialized knowledge ends up translating, unsurprisingly, into a hierarchy of resources, a hierarchy of who has economic control and decision-making power over how the thing itself works.
Right. So what's presented, and this was always the kind of Apple aesthetic, is a cleanliness and ease and accessibility of design. And that was always their unique selling point, right? In the various corporate battles that they would have in various iterations of technology. And people, not unreasonably, kind of, people like things that are clean, easy to use, and that are convenient. But what's lost is just power and agency, right? The thing is clean and convenient because it only has a few buttons. Well, now it only has a few buttons, right? So your choices are absolutely channeled into the options that are given to you by the manufacturers, rather than, I think, as Turkle saw the early computers as having this potential for a great democratizing of power.
Yeah.
The tools would be put in your own hand to build worlds. And that was why it would be so useful for children's personality development, because they could build worlds in which their personality could exist. Well, now you're being channeled into simulated worlds of others' design.
Of others' design. It's a worse second self. It's a less rich and meaningful second self than the one that Turkle believed existed in the early 1980s.
Yeah, and there's a key sort of political element here. Turkle at one point talks about an adult that she'd spoken to who really liked this transparent way that computers of the era would work, and really found it empowering to be able to type in lines of code and get the computer to predictably do things that were logical extensions or logical outcomes of the code that he developed. And this person would say, this is really a revolutionary model for how society and politics should work, right? Why is politics so messy and difficult to understand and so unpredictable? If it is run more along the lines of, or modeled more along a transparent computational aesthetic, then it'll not only be more rational and efficient, but it'll be more transparent and can be more affected by citizens. And the hope was that would become the great sort of democratizing force. Well, instead, we've got something very different, right? And maybe the most opaque thing that affects our daily life, including our political life, in this age of AI and this age of social media, is the algorithm, right? And what is the algorithm? It's something that's a small elite has designed that invisibly exercises huge kind of choice, huge dominion over the news we read, the entertainment that we're shown, the politics that we get.
The things we buy.
Yeah, the things we buy are all driven by, algorithmically determined choices that we can't have access to, right? Or we don't have access to. We don't know why we're being channeled in this direction or recommended this thing. And quite often we don't even know that that's happening. So all of a sudden you wake up and someone's won the election and you thought it was impossible. And how could this be possible? Because every news story I read was that this person was a moron.
Yeah.
And yet it turns out the majority of the country actually thought something very different.
And to make the opacity of the algorithm even worse is that you have no idea how to control it. Or if anything you do makes it seems to make some things you do seem to make a difference, right? We're on YouTube, right?
Right.
We famously always talk about, well, what is the algorithm of YouTube? Who knows? You don't know what you can do, if anything, to affect it. You don't know what it responds to. And yet it gives you the illusion of control, right? Which is maybe the most insidious thing about it all.
Yeah.
So when Turkle's writing about early PC culture, she's writing about the actual capacity to control, right? People understand why. Okay, if you messed up your code, the thing doesn't work. Or, there's an explanation for what you're doing and how you're doing it, and you can learn how to control the thing. The algorithm seems to have a life of its own, even as it offers us the illusion that we somehow have some kind of input into determining its outcome.
Yeah, you're right. And it's a pernicious illusion because for some of the same reasons that humans are determined to anthropomorphize artificial intelligence, the human brain is a sort of pattern-seeking mechanism, and it will try to find order where there is no order. And if you present it with an essentially random algorithm, or an algorithm that is so mathematically complex and draws on such reserves of data that's also made invisible to you, that there's no possible way that you can comprehend why it's giving you the responses that it's giving you, you will nonetheless believe that you're doing things that are causing it to give those responses.
Exactly.
And so what it's telling you to do is work harder. But it's the ultimate form of dominion over you, because it's all you can control is working harder. You try and understand it. The thing is fundamentally non-understandable.
Right.
And so you're going to, by the very nature of the human brain, you're going to just expend more and more effort to try and make sense of this reality that is nonsensical.
Either it will lead to this kind of hyper anxiety about what can be done, which, again, is an illusion, or it seems to me that it encourages the exact opposite, which is just dropping out altogether. Right. The only way that you can escape being presented with stuff that the algorithm has decided that you need to see or you want to see is by just unplugging entirely. Neither option of which, by the way, is consistent with what Turkle pitched as the sort of positive, participatory, potentially democratically illuminating and empowering elements of early PC culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I do think one great benefit of revisiting this 40-year-old book is to see how much the frog has been boiled, right? How much over 40 years we've accepted increasing opacity in our technologies and increasing centrality of these technologies to all aspects of our civic and individual life, to the point that you end up taking it as perfectly reasonable that most of your life paths are determined by algorithms that you cannot understand, you have no access to,
Right.
and that are operating in realms completely beyond your understanding.
An increasing disempowerment of individual capacity, of the capacity of citizens. And one of the other interesting things is that this pattern of imagining a new technology as emancipatory, as leading to greater participation and control and citizen interaction and autonomy that devolves over time into just full-on disempowerment, this is not unique to personal computers. Right, we have seen this over and over and over again. Think about the promises, and even in this series, we've talked a lot about the kinds of ways in which human beings imagine their inventions and the kinds of promise and potential and optimism that they invest so many of these technological achievements with, which come to take on a nightmarish, disempowering cast. Nuclear energy, for example. Right, or any of the kind of the fears of robots, or we see it in all aspects, and we see that here as well. Right, an early, very optimistic sense of what computers can mean for people and for a good community, for a good society, that devolves over time into just layers and layers of disempowerment. Think about the early promises of social media, right? You were mentioning off camera, like the way that Twitter, for example, was extolled, right, when it came out, that this was going to be a bulwark against autocracy, a bulwark against totalitarianism, because no longer would central entities be able to control the flow of information in the way that has been historically essential to the maintenance of autocracy. Well, what has actually happened, right? Sort of the exact opposite, and in a way that has supercharged those kinds of tendencies toward disempowerment and hierarchy in the political realm.
Yeah, I think so. All right, shall we move to our last category?
Yes.
Okay, weird artifacts of the 1980s. Speaking as a weird artifact of, well, I'm a weird artifact of the late 1970s, but I certainly, I came of consciousness in this decade. What is it that Sherry Turkle says in 1984 that seems odd now or didn't quite pan out? I have a number of candidates for this. One fear that she has, amidst a generally optimistic book, she has a fear that computers as kind of hyper-predictable, hyper-rational things might sort of lead children in particular, as the most, developmentally vulnerable members of our society, into like overly constrained kind of computational way. Everyone's going to be Mr. Spock. There's going to be a kind of diminution of emotion in society. I find that a strange reading of where we've gone. The dangers or the fears I see of the computational society, and particularly the AI-inflected society, is chaos, misinformation, opacity. It's not everything is too predictable and everyone is just a hyper-efficient Mr. Spock bot without emotion. In fact, one of the things that algorithmic experiences of the world has done is play up the most florid of human emotions, exactly. Right? Where like what is an online life? It's the sort of the opportunity to be absolutely outraged by things that you would never have known about prior to the development of these technologies.
Right. I mean, what the algorithm does, I guess, is it uncovers the repressed all the time, and pitches you in a register of barely conscious desire and fantasy all the time.
Yes. A link to this, she says that simulated worlds like computer games will be sources of reassurance because they're predictable and rule-based for adolescents. I'm not sure that all of the, I mean, again, it's sort of the same point, right? The simulated unreal world of Instagram seems to be a source of anxiety rather than reassurance for the adolescent.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it varies here. There is the world of video games that, some of the most popular video games of the last decade or so have been these kind of open world games like Minecraft, right, where you go in and there are rules, but it's essentially open to play and create as you see fit. I think she would like those kinds of experiences, but of course the video game world is full of all other kinds of experiences as well, which are nowhere near as empowering as those kind of open world games might be.
Right. it's a quote, "Computer metaphors can turn into a new popular psychology for the culture at large." And she has other examples of hearing friends say like, well, I'm debugging myself, or I sort of glitched, like using programming terminology to describe human mental states. I'm not sure this really happened. I mean, I don't see people walking around saying, you know, I'm a 404 error or...
Yeah, I mean, there was a time when people would talk about they were buffering. You know,
Did that really happen?
I don't know. What's his face on Top Gear says it.
Does he really?
Yeah.
But does he stand in for the general trend of
none of
humanity?
None of those guys should.
But it's, I don't think that ever happened. I think that was something
like glitch. It's glitchy. I'm glitchy. Or is that? I mean, glitches is really sort of still reserved for technological stuff, right?
I think so. You wouldn't describe yourself as
glitched, right?
Yeah, that would be a weird.
What about people freezing? Like you do hear that a lot.
I suppose so, but isn't that a human metaphor that was brought into the computational realm? And I think that so I think the point that is true is there is a two-way exchange between this is definitely true. It's the foundation of artificial intelligence research, right? Is the model of the human mind as a metaphor for non-human reasoning, particularly sort of computational reasoning, and where that came from was the goal of artificial intelligence researchers, which are a distinct subset of the computational community, and especially where maybe they're kind of imperialistic or hegemonic at this point, at least at this stage, they were a distinct subset. Their only model for something that did what they wanted, which was be an artificial intelligence, was the human mind. So they were obviously going to use that metaphor in trying to construct and to some degree legitimate the activities they were engaged in.
Right.
For adults, one thought was a computer as a simple, understandable, accessible system would become the model other systems should follow. I think we've covered that. That certainly hasn't happened, you know, but was a prediction here. A couple of things that, you know, are just victims of time. In the AI chapter, Turkle makes a big deal of the need for an AI or the barrier for an AI to beat the world champion at chess. Still seen as a far-off barrier in 1984.
And wasn't it only a few years later?
That is 1997 that Garry Kasparov is defeated. So 13 years later. This would be seen, Turkle wrote, as a signal achievement by AI experts, the crossing of a major threshold, but was a far-off barrier. Page 241, no machine today exists that could even come close to passing the Turing test.
ChatGPT
is Hong Kong,
the conversation.
Afraid not. Yeah. AI, I think we've covered this. AI theories share with psychoanalysis the pretension to be a new interpretive metaphor for the culture as a whole. In a sense, that's not true in that we didn't start talking about human psychology in AI terms. In another sense, there is a deeper truth there, right? Which is Turkle's key methodological approach in this book. She's trained as a psychoanalyst to approach human technology relations as essentially an extension of earlier psychoanalytic debates. That I think is valid and useful and actually gets to the core of certainly, you know, the AI debates. Because it's, you know, to what extent is it one psychology trying to explore and understand another?
Right. I think in general, I think that Turkle is she's more on the mark here than she's off the mark.
Yeah.
And sometimes with these kinds of predictions, there's a reason why when I write, I don't predict anything. And it's because you just don't, you cannot do that in any meaningful way. Yeah. You're going to be wrong. And maybe there's something that's kind of seductive about making these kinds of predictions, particularly at the end of a long analysis. But I think for me, the lesson is, you know, better off not doing that.
Yeah, I think as you always say, you never make predictions, especially about the future. And you also told me you were the person who invented that phrase. So I definitely believe that.
Well, it's plausibly true.
It's plausibly true. ChatGPT told me that you invented that phrase. And I want to leave everyone with a point that she makes at the end of the book that I think definitely does hold up, as much of the book does, you know, both as an analytical work, but also as a real time capsule, a real study of a moment in time that we can productively learn from. Turkle says towards the end of the book that she's talking about the line between the human and the artificial. Arguments about human uniqueness based on what computers can't do. They can't beat a chess world champion. They can't pass the Turing test. Leave us vulnerable to technical progress and what clever engineers might come up with. And so she's anticipating that these predictions or these hurdles are going to be crossed. And then what is the argument that's left about human uniqueness.
Yeah.
So arguments based on capacities are always going to be vulnerable to technical progress. By the same token, assertions of human uniqueness, like John Searle's argument about, I think we've talked about this before, the person inside, it's called the Chinese box experiment, the person with all the Chinese characters who's given inside a box, who's given a series of detailed instructions as to how the characters go together, and is told to like interpret poetry or create meaningful works in Chinese by someone who passes him notes through the box. The person inside the box can do this successfully to the outside observer because the stuff makes sense, but they can't read Chinese. What they're doing is they're following a very detailed set of instructions in total ignorance of what they mean. And this is John Searle's argument that the human brain is in the end unique because all of the forms of, it's only the human brain that can read Chinese. Right, all of the forms of reasoning are just operating from very detailed instructions to give the impression of understanding. Right, Turkle makes the point that in the end is not a reasoned argument for human uniqueness. It's a flat assertion. It's an argument from definition, and it is in the end romantic, not scientific, and it's defensible on romantic grounds only.
Yeah.
Between those two poles, we have the AI dilemma, right? That any argument about human uniqueness or difference from AI that's based on capacities is vulnerable to technical progress, as we've just demonstrated in the 40 years since the second self. Yeah. Any argument that doesn't rest upon capacities and is invulnerable to technical progress is a flat and romantic assertion.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate between those two poles?
Yeah, and it just brings us back to the orienting question of a lot of what we've been doing in this series, which is the question of what makes people people, right? What is it? And this kind of age-old desire that human beings have had to try to define the human experience and the human condition. And AI presents, as have other technologies over the course of humanity, it presents a particularly acute kind of challenge, right, to this felt desire to be constantly trying to understand what makes people people.
Okay, so I don't know fully what makes people people, but I do know what makes good people, and that's people who've watched to the end of this discussion, this episode of two middle-aged guys discuss a 40-year-old book. We salute you. If you've made it to the end, you are good people. You're definitely not an AI.
They'd be even better people if they liked and subscribed.
And on that bombshell.